In the dusty scrublands of central Mexico, four sisters built a business that looked like a small family bar, but worked like a rolling slaughterhouse. On the surface, they were just the ladies who ran the place. Underneath, they turned houses into prisons, where women and even their unborn children were disposable. This is my Maniac Mind, and today we're going into the story of the most monstrous women in Mexican crime, the Sisters González, known as Las Poquianchis. Their crimes stretched over 2 states, 2 decades, and left behind mass graves that still show up in new construction sites. By the end of this, you'll hear the voices of the victims, the psychology of the killers, and how a whole local system turned a blind eye because money was easier than justice. Let's start in the 1910s, in a small town called El Salto in the state of Jalisco. The sisters were María Delfina, María del Carmen, María Luisa, and María de Jesús González. Their father, Isidoro, was either a local cop or a vigilante death squad commander, depending on who you ask. What matters is that he was a sadist. He beat his wife and daughters for tiny things. He forced the older girls to watch him torture prisoners in the town jail. He locked his eldest daughter, María Delfina, in solitary cell darkness for days just because she wore makeup. When the girls cried, their mother would only say, "Go pray for your sins," and retreat to the kitchen. That cruelty carved something hard and cruel into the sisters' souls. By the time they were adults, their father was gone, and they had to survive on their own. They opened a small bar in San Francisco del Rincón, a town locals called San Pancho, in the state of Guanajuato. It didn't bring much money, so they improvised. They started selling sex in the back rooms, at first using themselves because they didn't have husbands and their lovers came and went. The real danger started when they turned into recruiters. They advertised in newspapers for maids and waitresses in respectable homes, promising good pay, food, and a better life. They drove a shiny car into poor villages, posing as kind older women who could save their daughters. Families handed over girls as if they were sending them to a miracle. Most of these girls were teenagers from rural poverty. They trusted the sisters because they looked like mothers, not monsters. Once they were on the ranch, the illusion evaporated. They were given no real cash, only chips that were supposed to be counted later. In reality, the girls always owed money, and asking to go home was treated as rebellion. By the 1940s, the sisters ran 4 brothels across Jalisco and Guanajuato. They were known locally as Las Poquianchis, a slang term for male homosexuals, repurposed for the women who ran the bar. At first, conditions were poor, but not yet monstrous. They had small rooms, rudimentary bathrooms, and a schedule that rotated women between clients like a cheap assembly line. That changed when a law cracked down on prostitution in the 1950s. Their legal cover vanished, and the business went underground. The sisters' networks turned into filthy, locked-down brothels. The women were no longer employees, they were prisoners. Their ranch, which they called El Ángel, the angel, was on the border between Guanajuato and Jalisco. They housed girls in a converted cowshed. There was no proper toilet. They were taken outside like livestock to relieve themselves, and there was no real kitchen or shower. They washed only when there were many clients stacked up in a row. Here's where the killings started small and quietly. One of the first known victims was a girl named Blanca, who arrived in her early teens. Years later, she got pregnant. They did a crude backroom abortion in the ranch. It went wrong, she hemorrhaged, and became disabled. They kept her in a makeshift hospital for a while, then dragged her back to the ranch and basically left her to die. Her body was buried in the yard, and the workers realized people who died here did not just disappear. They were buried in the dirt right under the windows. Other women died in accidents, like a fight that ended with 2 women falling from a balcony. Their bodies were also buried in the same place. From that moment, the psychology of the place shifted. The surviving women knew where the bodies were. They knew the sisters were not just pimps, but killers. At first, murders were exceptions. Later, they became routine. Anyone who got sick, who lost their attractiveness, or who tried to hoard a few coins or gifts from clients was marked. A palace executioner working for the sisters would come and finish the job. Pregnant girls were forced into brutal, makeshift abortions. If the body didn't cooperate, they were simply killed. The ranch worked like a conveyor belt of cruelty, where breath itself was a temporary commodity. The sisters rarely touched the victims with their own hands. Instead, they had a network of helpers, a driver, a torturer, a captain from the army nicknamed Black Eagle. María Delfina's lover, Captain Hermenegildo, was both a lover and a fixer. He handled police bribes, smoothed over complaints, and helped organize the network. If a girl tried to run, the sisters used psychological torture. They told one older sister she had a choice: kill her younger, pregnant sister, or watch the younger girl sold into a nightmare where 30 men a day would rape her. The older sister chose to kill. That kind of manipulation turned the victims into accomplices of their own horror. For years, nothing happened. The police knew about the brothels. Local politicians drank there, slept with the women, and took free service. Doctors issued fake health certificates saying no one had venereal disease. In a way, the whole system was on their payroll. The sisters grew arrogant. They killed not only the girls, but also male clients who came to the ranch with too much money. Migrant workers returning from the United States brought savings. If a man was dumb enough to show off his cash, he was lured, robbed, and then killed. Why let a client return for 100 visits when you could get all his money at once? The system finally started to crack in January 1964. A girl named Catalina Arteaga escaped the brothel and arrived at a police station in León, covered in dust and barely standing. She told them she had run from a brothel run by 4 sisters who murdered women and buried them in the yard. She was later called Josefina Gutiérrez in the files to protect her identity. This single confession was enough to trigger a raid. Several police units descended on the ranch. The sisters were tipped off by someone inside the force and tried to flee on a bus. Other passengers recognized them and pointed them out. When they were arrested, María Delfina still threatened the clerk, boasting that powerful friends would protect her. This time, those friends stayed silent. The search of the ranch was a nightmare in broad daylight. Police dragged out 12 emaciated, half-mad women from the cowshed. They looked like they had been dragged out of a pit. Far worse was what the searchers found outside. Using shovels, they uncovered fresh graves with the remains of women, at least 1 man, and about a dozen stillborn or newborn babies. The shock spilled into the national press. The trial was held in a small-town courtroom packed with journalists from Mexico, the US, and Europe. The sisters sat in the dock, guarded by armed police, while the public screamed at them. Victims stood in the aisles, shouting accusations, and the sisters shouted back, cursing them in the same way they had cursed them in the ranch. The court moved suspiciously fast. The trial lasted only about a week. Only 2 sisters, María Delfina and María de Jesús, were convicted of murder and given 40 years in prison. María Luisa got a slap on the wrist sentence for a minor offense, which outraged the public. The Black Eagle captain and several other accomplices were also sentenced. Many people suspected a cover-up. Prosecutors and police didn't want the full web of corruption exposed. How many bribes? How many signed-off certificates? How many favors to local officials? The easy solution was to put most of the blame on the three sisters and let the rest of the system quietly disappear. Even after the trial, the death count stayed murky. Officially, the sisters were tied to 91 proven murders. Unofficially, investigators and researchers later estimated that the real number might be closer to 200. In 2002, when the land was sold and the old ranch buildings were being torn down, workers uncovered another mass grave with about 20 more bodies. This is when the psychological horror of the sisters becomes almost industrial. They didn't just run a brothel. They built a system that mirrored modern human trafficking schemes. They recruited girls with fake jobs, normalized abuse, then drained them until they were no longer useful. For American listeners, this story feels disturbingly familiar. Today, girls are recruited online with promises of modeling, singing, or YouTube fame. They're promised a camera, a brand deal, maybe even a US visa. Instead, they get locked rooms, debt, and threats. The pattern is the same: poverty, desperation, and the promise of a better life turned into a hunting ground for monsters who don't look like monsters at all. The sisters themselves never really seemed to regret anything. Their background of abuse, religious rigidity, and embedded violence warped their sense of empathy. To them, vulnerability was not a reason to show mercy. It was a reason to exploit harder. They saw their victims as things to be used, not as people to be pitied. Later, tabloids and sensational stories added layers of myth. Supposed satanic rituals, roosters sacrificed in blood, or even rumors that flesh was sold in the market at 3 pesos per kilo. Most serious investigators treat those as exaggerations. The real horror doesn't need embellishment. The story of the sisters González is a reminder that the most terrifying predators often look like ordinary people. They run businesses. They speak politely. They recruit with kindness. Only later do you see the cages, the graves, and the calculation behind every smile. So where are they now? The sisters died in prison over the years. María Delfina is said to have died under suspicious circumstances, and some believe she was poisoned or killed by someone who wanted to silence her. Their ranch was abandoned, then turned into a kind of morbid tourism site, visited by bloggers and TV crews who sometimes treat it like a haunted house attraction. In the United States, this story is a mirror. It's not hard to imagine a girl in Texas, California, or Florida clicking on a casting notice that looks legit, only to land in a situation where her phone gets taken, her passport held, and her boss says, "You owe me for the trip." The sisters didn't invent this model. They simply perfected it in small towns before cartels and gangs did it on a national scale. So the real question is not just, what were they like? It's, how many other networks like this are still operating today, hidden in plain sight? Because the sisters didn't just commit crimes. They built a business model of sexual slavery that later cartels and gangs copied, right down to the way they promised a future nobody could refuse.